for 25 years. And not only in my professional life, but also in my personal life. A lot of what I am today, both as a person and as a professional, I owe a lot to him. And I'm most grateful that he's still there to guide me, and he continues to inspire me every day. And I'm so delighted that he's here today to speak to all of us. Um, for those who don't know, Mr. Gill is one of India's most senior and respected bankers, having spent 34 years in the profession. 25 of these years were spent with Deutsche Bank, and he was the Chief Country Officer and Chief Executive Officer of Deutsche Bank India from 2012 to 2019. India is Deutsche Bank's largest and most profitable geography in Asia Pacific. During this period, while he was the CEO, he was also a member of the Management Committee of the Indian Banks Association, the apex body of Indian banking, and he also sat on the Asia Pacific board of Deutsche Bank AG. From March 2019 to March 2020, Ravneet was the managing director and CEO of Yes Bank, India's fourth largest private sector bank. Yes Bank, as we know, was plagued with legacy governance and asset quality issues, and as a result of which, the regulator, Reserve Bank of India, brought Ravneet in to run its operations. He demitted office when SBI acquired a majority stake in the bank. He is one of a handful of bankers in India to have been a CEO of both a foreign bank and a local bank. Ravneet is deeply passionate about sport, education, conservation, and art, and he also sits on the advisory board of one of the Indian Premier League's franchises. Ravneet, as I said, I'm most excited to have you here. I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you very much, Radha, and thank you to all the members. Really, it's a privilege to be, speaking to all of you. There is so much, such admirable work that all of you do that I thought that, given the fact that I've got the opportunity to speak to you, I must speak on a subject, which is of relevance to you, and which is of great relevance to India and India's future, which is effectively speaking, education. So one of the things which I've been very passionate about through my life has actually been education. My mother was an educationist, and as a matter of fact, you talked about the autism part of it. She was one of India's leading authorities on autism, and then I have two elder sisters, both of whom were educationists as well. But I'll try and provide you a very contemporary and a practical view of education. And when we talk about digitalization of learning, it is really in terms of how technology is changing the whole paradigm of learning and the future of learning. So just to be able to lay the context out for you, India happens to be has the largest student population in the world. Totally 360 million kids are studying in India at any point in time. Out of the 360 million, about 36 million pass out of school every single year. And out of these 36 million who pass out of school every year, only 9.5 million go on to pursue higher education. So the dropout rate there is really strong, is really high. But that's not where the story ends. Out of the 9.5 million children who decide to pursue higher education in India, and I don't include kids who go overseas to do an MBA engineering or some other stream or discipline. These kids end up spending about $8 billion on this higher education in India. And out of this $8 billion, $4.6 billion gets spent on tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 institutions in this country. The sad part is that only 7% of the kids who graduate from these tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 institutions are deemed to be employable. And these are figures which are ASSOCHAM's, not my research or finding. So think about the fact that, we keep talking about India's demographic dividend. If this dividend has to actually play out and not become a dividend curse, I think our higher education needs to change. It needs to become a lot more skill-based. It needs to become a lot more employability focused relative to where it currently is. But that is not where the whole digitalization comes in. The digitalization comes in from the fact that on the back of COVID, 80% of the student population of the world across schools, colleges, universities have got dislocated. They cannot go back to classrooms yet. and are studying from home, from remote locations, online. And this is where I think a major transformation awaits us. And if we are not very cognizant about that, it could have massive ramifications for the future of a youth. So what is it that is so dramatic that makes me say what I just said? Uh, the problem really is that even the top universities of the world, the top colleges of the world, even though they have shifted from offline to online, they just feel that the content that they were providing in classrooms is the same content that they can provide online as well. And it does not matter, like I mentioned, even the Ivy League colleges of the US, currently are facing that particular challenge. And the problem is that when a child learns online, the typical attention span is only 7 minutes. 7 minutes, as we know, is too short to go through entire class, forget a chapter or any other course. And unless you cannot and you can and unless you are able to deepen that engagement, elongate that engagement, chances are that you will lose students. And the fact that even those who will attend your classes will not learn that much. So the UN and WHO studies are now indicating that in the last 12 months, where kids were learning from home, their cognitive abilities on average have declined by 20%. Think about what implications that has again for our youth. So a lot of what you will see in future, hopefully, is that as education moves more from offline to online, it won't just be a question of changing the channel of distribution. That is effectively the pipe, the plumbing. What really will matter is what flows through that plumbing. And how are you able to convert content which was being delivered offline relative to the content that you would deliver online so that people remain very engaged and learn a lot. I'll give you a small example over here of India's best known edtech company, which is Byju's. In May last year, Byju's valuation was roughly about $8 billion. That valuation today is $15 billion. And one of the things which is not often talked about Byju's is a very interesting experiment that they did ahead of the curve before anybody else did. So Byju's went to Disney and said that, look, we don't want your animation, but we want your characters. So whether it was a Mickey Mouse, a Donald Duck, I mean, these were all characters whom children worldwide related to. So they went to Disney and said, give us your characters, we will do the animation ourselves. And the first time around, Disney actually turned it around and told them that they will not do it. But then as Byju started to grow, Disney thought there was something in there and eventually went back to them and said, we are willing to provide you our characters. And based on those characters, on that iconography, Byju's was able to create a whole constituency of young children who got attracted to that and started to learn online. So one of the things that you will see going forward, which will be very interesting, is the marriage between the large education companies and the large content providers. And when I talk about content providers, this is not educational content. This is content which all of us consume on television, on cinema, which is effectively speaking entertainment, music, and so on and so forth. So even though it seems almost like sacrilege for many of us who are old school and who thought there was something very sacrosanct about education, how can you marry it to cinema? How can you marry it to entertainment? The fact of the matter is that storytelling will need to come back into education. If online education needs to keep people engaged, if people have to learn on computer screens, years and years of education, then that whole element of storytelling will need to come back. And one of the things which you will, as I mentioned, see is that, cinema and education will come much closer together. So there is a concept called consumer screen time. So whether you watch Netflix or Amazon or normal television, a sports channel, or for the younger generation who play esport or other things, all these, or consume education, all this is a portion of screen time. And one of the ways to be able to make education much more meaningful, much more impactful, is to be able to blend various elements of screen time to make education that much more interesting, that much more engaging. So this is a very interesting thing which will evolve. it will not only impact education for many of you who have your companies or work for companies, even a lot of corporate learning and development will go down that path. The second thing which I would like to say here is the thing around e-sport, which is for many of us who are not initiated into this is the video gaming and the games that children play on smartphones. This is one area where the channel of communication between parents and children has broken down. Every parent believes that it's a waste of time, and that it will lead to addiction, and it eats into children's time either in a gym or on a play field or in terms of study. The importance of e-sport is that a lot of our learning, both at an educational level in schools, colleges, and in terms of corporate learning and development, will actually get gamified. What that will do is it will enable you to imbibe any corporate learning and development at any time, at any place of your choice. But more importantly, even if you were a group of 20 sitting and learning that, we are all at different parts, at different stages of our careers. We do different things within the same organization, and our learning and development needs are very different. So what gamification will effectively do is be able to customize learning for each one of us, so that even though we'll be sitting in one classroom, the content that will get delivered to each of us individually will be very different. Think about this from the point of view of what you would want to do with respect to this, in terms of greater awareness in your own companies, whether you're an entrepreneur or a professional, your children's schools, other educational initiatives that you may be involved with. But unless we are able to successfully transition from offline content to online content, a lot of education institutions, regardless of how hallowed they are, how long-standing they are, will actually fall by the wayside. The future of learning will look very different for those of us who believe that eventually the vaccine will come and life will return to normal. In some aspects, it will, of course, return to normal. But the shift that is now happening from offline to online, that is an irreversible trend. That will happen with respect to pretty much everything that we do. And it is important that India, given the fact that it has the largest student population in the world, is at the forefront of all of this, and is actually driving a lot of that change. And India will drive that change for the simple reason that even if you look at some of the dynamics, obviously for online, internet becomes very important. Out of the next 1 billion new internet users, in the world, 650 million will come in India. Also equally, if you look at it, India has become, the global back office for animation, specifically children's animation. And that again will have a massive impact in terms of how education gets delivered going forward. With that, I will, end my monologue. Very happy to take questions, and provide further clarity if any that is required. But as I said, whether you're a parent, whether you're a sibling, whether you are a business leader, an entrepreneur, I think it's important that all these things become more come to the forefront in terms of how our HR is thinking about it, how we are thinking about it, how our children are thinking about it, how the schools and colleges are thinking about it. I think one of the things that India has suffered from in the past is our physical infrastructure has been very constrained. It's such a large country that you cannot build brick and mortar branches of schools, colleges everywhere. But with the coming of internet, a lot of that problem will get sorted out. You will actually be able to reach out to every single Indian, regardless of which village, tehsil, that person may be in. But the key to that will be the kind of content we end up delivering to them. And if we can get that right, I would say that both educationally and in terms of India's professional and economic future, things could be very bright and things could change very quickly. So I will end with that. I hope some of this, is new to you, something which provides a new insight, which you may not have been, cognizant of or aware of. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to respond to those.
Thank you, Ranveet. I'm sure that we have a lot of questions. It's a new area, and and everybody's seeing the changes happening right in front of our eyes. And you know, I will ask you the first question. Going forward now, all these institutions globally, top 20, top 30, top 100, they have set up colleges all over the world with large campuses, 500 acres, even up to 1,000 acres. And now things are all going online. So slowly, even these colleges themselves have online courses, mostly online or on a hybrid variety. And I'm sure, as you say, they may continue that. So where do you think all that real estate, that campus experience and the 1,000-acre, won't that all get diluted? The university experience of a student?
I think that's a very, very relevant point. First and foremost, before I come to the campuses, there's a very strong social dimension of learning. And the whole community aspect of it. When you go to classrooms, you meet people, you interact with peers, and that experience itself is very educative for us. I think technology will solve for that. I have over the last 6 months seen so many changes in technology, which are making teaching, learning so much more collaborative, so much more interactive. And I think that social experience will get replicated. The issue that has really fundamentally changed is mindset. I remember when I was growing up, if somebody was looking to do as they were known at that time, correspondence course, it was supposed to be the second best option compared to learning on campus or in a classroom. But what has happened on the back of COVID is that that option is no longer available to us. So God forbid if there was another pandemic or a third or a fourth wave, children can't just stay out endlessly. And we put everything deferred and say that when normalcy returns, children can go back to classrooms. Chances are that over the next 2 to 3 years, this continues to be the trend for a lot of our children. So what then happens to the large campuses? I can tell you this even in India, for a couple of large groups who have traditionally worked on the brick and mortar model, where they've had large campuses, large play fields to try and make their education a lot more 360 degrees, are right now hurting. Children are not, attending classes. Parents are asking for, waivers in terms of fees and other administrative expenses that were there. Collections have been very erratic. And if you look at it from a medium-term perspective, the government in various geographies will need to allow these promoters to be able to use their campuses for other, activities. Obviously, these were, approved specifically for purposes of education. But the fact is that not immediately, but in 5 to 7 years' time, the whole model around this usage of these physical infrastructure will need to change, because education alone will not be able to pay for it. So I would say that over the next 5-7 years, the large campuses will disappear.
Sounds very sad. Okay, we have a question from Akhil Shahani, Dr. Akhil Shahani.
Thanks, Vicky. Ravneet, great overview of the digital learning space. So let's talk a bit about the future of work. The thing is, the BFSI industry has been some of the first adopters of technology over the last couple of decades. But how do you see upskilling and retraining existing corporate employees with respect to the future of work, where a lot of work is going to be automated and the skills that they've learned so far may not be relevant? So how do you see digital learning helping with upskilling and reskilling existing corporate employees?
Again, very relevant point. I'll give you a very small example in terms of how upskilling is working. So there is a cutting-edge science and technology research university in Switzerland, and the research that they're currently doing is that for people who were very good gamers and whose fingers and fine motor skills were very fine, that once they stop, playing, they should become surgeons. So you've seen robotic surgery everywhere in the world. These are people who have no understanding of medical science, but are so deft with using their fingers, and their fine motor skills are so good that these people could effectively go on to become surgeons going forward. Similarly, I think if you look at it from the point of view of BFSI, I still remember having a conversation. This was in 2012 with one of India's most admired corporate chieftains who was heavily into technology, and he was saying that how the tech companies will have the bank's breakfast. The question I asked him was that everything else I completely agree with. Please explain to me, how will you take the human element out of risk assessment? And he said, Ravneet, one of the first things that will get disintermediated is actually risk. So what will happen is that data analytics will enable you to make risk assessments based on live data relative to the more passive balance sheet kind of analysis that we as traditional bankers were used to. So I think the issue that is really fundamental here is that whichever profession we may be in, today they may have a very light touch as far as technology is concerned. But the fact of the matter is the future is data analytics. And if we cannot learn data literacy and we cannot become computer literate is too basic a term and it's too old-fashioned a term, but let's say that there's no digital literacy, I think it will become very difficult to run any of our functions going forward. I'll give you a very small example. That as managers, we were used to the fact that we were in offices all the time. If we wanted to get into a huddle, go into a breakout room, 5 or 6 of us used to get together, have a discussion, quickly take a decision, move on. That does not happen. You may now have a situation where you don't see even your direct reports for months on end. How do you create that, continue to maintain that trust, that the communication, the coordination, and remain very nimble in terms of decision making? It'll again come down to being able to be very savvy in terms of your communication skills, albeit on a digital basis. So my sense is that while technology will disintermediate a lot of functions, I think it'll create newer functions as well. I think the ability to be able to deal with much broader bandwidth will come through as a result of technology. And to that extent, I don't think that the job losses will be as extreme as they're made out to be. If you look at let's say a very underbanked market like India, where it was physically not possible to deal with the volumes that exist today, it will become possible. So for you to go into areas where earlier it was difficult on the back of technology, on the back of data, on the back of data analytics, I think newer areas will open up. I think cost efficiencies will kick in. I think your risk assessment will become a lot more spot on, and to that extent losses will be lower. So I personally think that one of the biggest challenges for corporate India right now is the training its managers with respect to data literacy and data analytics. So one, of course, is the amount of money that will need to get spent on this. Second is these people will need to be taken out of their jobs for them to be trained before you can reinduct them into newer functions. And to that extent, I think the pandemic is a blessing in disguise. It gives you that downtime, effectively speaking, where you could take people out in batches, retrain them, and then bring them back into the mainstream. And I would say that based on my own personal experience and purely going by empirical data that I see, not enough of that is happening.
Thank you.
Oh. So, any more questions?
Okay, Bernard has a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi,
Bernard.
Ravneet.
Hello.
Pleasure to see you.
Very good to see you.
Also, Radha, really nice. And there you can see, how Deutsche bankers can also adapt to modern times. And I have to say, Ravneet, heads off, really hot topic. And if you look at India, we had the Y2K, which ballooned the Indian IT industry. Now we have Corona, which looks as if it's booming the Indian biotech industry. And probably your topic will boom the Indian education industry. And I think India has all the opportunities that are there with its young population and with its need to educate. And from that angle, I think with your ideas and with things like Ronnie Screwwala's upgrades and with Baidu that you mentioned and other activities, I think a lot can happen and will happen. On the other hand, and the recent developments actually, funnily enough, in banking, and when you see the debacle that we just witnessed on Archegos, and how a bank like Credit Suisse doesn't see what's going on, it's more than obvious that technology is one thing, but somewhere the human brain and the human thinking also has to be there. Otherwise, risk assessment and other things, when you look at pure technology, it just will not work. So from that angle, I would be really interested. We are all old people. This Rotary Club here, where I've been a member for almost 30 years, we are all old people. You are also old, but your thinking is still young, and I think that's what I like. But when we really look at how things, and Corona is indeed one of the witnesses that is telling us, hey guys, the world is changing, but you haven't realized it as yet. So how can old people like us really see that change and drive that change? Because it's inevitable. On the other hand, when we see our youngsters and how they are depending on the gadgets, how they are depending on, I don't know whether they will see the danger that is also out there. And just to end my little comment here and my question, one element that you should also mention is the fact that you're also into sports. Because one thing of this pandemic and one thing of all these webinars that we're having here is a real problem. And therefore, I'm always saying webinars should not be allowed to be conducted unless before or after you have a 10-minute exercise break. Your computer will switch off unless you're moving around with it in your flat or whatever. So it has to be mandatory that we exercise, because otherwise, whether it's child obesity or whatever, things will run very, very bad for all of us when we can't move around anymore. And therefore, please tell us a little bit also about your sports aspect that you're working on, because I think that is also very, very recommended. Sorry for that long introduction.
No, thank you very much. So I think the question that you asked, that what can older people like us do in this regard? The thing really is that in the world of yesterday, I would say, there was a lot of premium that was placed on gray hair. The fact is that we had seen it all. We had seen downtime, we had seen down cycles, we had seen recessions, we had seen economic downturns. So we knew how to react in a situation like that. And to that extent, it was experienced people like us who were in leadership positions. I think the world of tomorrow will be so different that I don't think our experience will count for too much. And I think if as older people, we could do two things. One is that, we promote younger people into leadership positions quicker than we did in the past. Just because it took us 20 years to become managing directors, I don't think we should, allow our young kids to do that. Second is that we should have, the recognition and the humility to understand that maybe they know a little more than we do in these matters. And so we should again become students, for want of a better term. I think if we can open our minds and we are humble enough to understand that, we go back into our student, life again, I think it will make a big difference to the quality of our lives as well. So we should be more trusting of the younger generation's ability to take the leadership and run with it, and the ability to refresh our thinking so that we don't become misfits in the world of tomorrow. Because if we continue to hold on to our old beliefs, chances are that, we will become completely out of step with the times. Since you talked about the sport thing, so besides education, the other thing which I was very passionate about, and I've always been passionate about through my life, is sport. And the sport is one, of course, is the element of playing and watching sport and enjoying sport. But the question I have for each one of you, and I'd love to hear a voice of dissent, is there any life skill that you cannot learn from sport? And not only life skill that you can't learn from sport, even if you go back to professional skills, whether it is teamwork, whether it's in terms of leadership, whether it's in terms of strategy, whether it's in terms of trust, cognitive flexibility, is there any of these things which we cannot learn from sport? And my favorite example with respect to that is that at 27, 28, we are young people in our organizations. We're not given too much responsibility, just somewhere in junior management. At 27, 28, Virat Kohli captains India and carries the aspirations of 1.35 billion Indians on a day-to-day basis and performs under that pressure day in and day out. If we could imbibe even 10% of that resilience and that emotional and mental toughness, imagine how much more effective we could become as professionals and as people. So what I did was that last year I reached out to a Swiss sports institute called AISTS, which was promoted by the International Olympic Committee. It's supposed to be the world's most advanced and most sophisticated sports MBA. And I went to them and I said that, look, India has the largest student population. It's absolutely imperative that you come to India. And the funny thing is, these guys had never stepped out of Switzerland. So it took a lot of convincing, but they were very enlightened about it. They finally come. So we've started off. I think the purpose of this is 2-3 things. One is to show the world that the connection between business and sport is much closer than people recognize it to be. Second, that sport and business can learn from each other a lot. And third, that sport and business can benefit from a lot from each other as well. And if tomorrow India has to go on to create a conveyor belt of high quality international talent, sporting talent, then it's important that the leaders of Indian sport are professionally qualified, are enlightened, understand the different elements of mental conditioning, nutrition, physical education, etc. So to come back to the point that you made, Mr. Sanuka, was that one of the things which came to the forefront as a result of the pandemic before the vaccine came was that if there was effectively one safety net that we had, was immunity. And we talked about immunity like never before. But immunity is not something which is intuitive. I mean, there is a deep science behind what goes into comprising immunity. It's a very holistic concept. It's deeply grounded in science. And how do we, each one of us as individuals, blend that into our lives so that we lead healthier lives going forward? So I think that was the whole idea in terms of getting the sports education here. I have to say that the government has been exceedingly supportive. Corporate India has been exceedingly supportive in terms of providing internships and job opportunities for these kids. But at the heart of it, remained education, and sport was only a metaphor for learning and development. But having said that, like I said, that each one of us would do a great service to community and to society at large if we could become evangelists of the fact that the future of education is going to be very different, and India has every single element that is required to become a pioneering leader in this field, provided we read the tea leaves a little earlier and embrace that change quicker than the rest of the world does.
Vicky, can I raise a question?
Nice. Yes. Rahul, go ahead.
Hi, Ravneet. You touched very briefly on a subject which is perplexing to me. That is the breaking down of communication between parents and children on this gaming aspect, the amount of time they spend on games. I have grandchildren of 8 and 10, and my son and daughter-in-law are in the mid-40s. And I always find this stress and tension between them. Saying that you kids are spending so much time on playing games, no more games for you for the rest of the week, and so on and so forth. I mean, could you elaborate a little more on this? Because I'm sure many other parents are going through this tussle. Is there something like addiction to gaming? Is there something like too much of gaming? What should be the ideal kind of proportion between gaming knowledge and education and the rest of the normal education as we have learned over our lives? Could you elaborate a bit?
Sure, sir. So is there something called too much gaming? Is there something called addiction? The answer to that is 100% yes. It is not as if that this is free of addiction. And the way to avoid that addiction is that parents and children have a line of communication rather than it breaking down. The problem that happens, Mr. Mehta, is that when you talk to your child that you played 75 minutes of Fortnite on your smartphone and no more Fortnite, one way to look at it also could be that you've played 75 minutes of Fortnite. Now I want you to go and spend 90 minutes in the gym. I'm just giving a very small, simplistic kind of answer. That it can also lead to positive reaffirmation. Because ultimately what happens is that if you cut off that 75 minutes of Fortnite or Clash of Clans or whatever that game the child plays, he will probably go and watch Netflix and Amazon and all of that, which does not have a competitive element to it and does not lead to building of social communities. So one thing I must tell you, which is very interesting and which I discovered also myself, is that one of the reasons why children play these games is not just the competitive element of playing against friends. They have a side social chat that continues. So there are platforms like Discord and all of that, where I could be playing with 5 other children, and we would, besides being playing, we would also be having a social communication going on. So in the days of lockdown, when children are cooped up at home and do not get to meet their friends as often as they would like, this becomes a very good channel for communication as well. So does it work on your social skills? The answer is 100% it works on your social skills. Does it improve your fine motor skills? The answer is 100% it improves. Does it improve your cognitive ability? Everywhere there is now overwhelming evidence from the best institutes that it does help. Question is that you cannot have a situation where a child is playing 4 to 5 hours a day. And that obviously is something which is not desirable and definitely should not be. Okay. But the thing that comes up is that you said that your son and daughter-in-law in their 40s and the children are 8 and 10. At 40, you typically are out of that age group. The age group that is the gaming population worldwide is between 12 and 35. So after 35, there's a steep drop-off of people who continue to game. Part of it has to do with how intuitively you take to technology and how what dexterity you have in your fingers with regard to gaming. But it is also a mindset issue. So one of the things which will happen when you start to collapse education and entertainment and other content together is that you will broaden the age profile of the people who will watch gaming. And that is where the breakdown in communication that happens today, or the stress that exists between parents and children, will start to go. Now, the thing really is, regardless of how old we become, we continue to remain competitive. So today your son will not play with your grandson because he knows he'll get beaten black and blue in any game that he plays, right? They're just quicker. Will you be able to slow down the game technologically, like you have a handicap in golf, where your son and your grandson play together, and your son has a certain handicap which enables him to compete on even terms with your grandson? We have to think about ways that not distance that generation even further, but how do you bring in the 40 plus generation into this so that at all points in time there is a very open line of communication and we are all the time building responsible, healthy playing habits in children. The answer to that is not that today you've played, now for the next 3 days you will not play. It is that how do we use the time that they spent on their smartphone playing the game to be able to get positive reinforcement on something else. That fine, 75 minutes of fortnight, provided you can study for 3 hours, provided you can spend 90 minutes in the gym as well. But because the 40 plus generation does not understand gaming, and the very term gaming has slightly negative connotations, even for people like you and me, there remain a lot of misconceptions. But now there is cutting edge research coming out of the best institutes, and I follow this personally very closely and very passionately, about how gaming is helping. And they say that if tomorrow the world will revolve around digital literacy, there is no better way to understand computers and computing than actually gaming. So I will take a step back, sir, and give you one final point with respect to this. Go back to Hollywood and check out Hollywood's top 10 franchises of all time. They are nothing but the games that people play on esports. So whether it was Indiana Jones or Avengers or whatever else it is, all those superhero movies, that is what effectively esport is. What esport has done is that, unlike cinema, where you're only at the end of your only participation is that by way of an audience, in esport you can become the protagonist. You can become one of the characters who's playing that a game and with your superheroes, and to that extent it becomes a much more immersive experience. So it is something which has lots of positives to it. Addiction is definitely one issue that we need to fight, and there needs to be education around that. But to my mind, the way to be able to address that concern around addiction is that we bring parents and children closer together. So one of the things which we are doing as part of our own education initiative also is on esports education and how to close that generation gap, which then leads these children to follow, not necessarily the best of, influencers to look for validation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's a very good point. Now, the next question is for Anil Lambo. Do you have a question?
Yeah, Ravneet,
And after that, Rohit.
I have some practical challenges. I'm involved with a charitable school in the rural Rajasthan. And we have a big problem getting good teachers. So we introduced smart classes and digital learning, which was a big problem even to make the teachers teach. And then government changes in Rajasthan every 5 years, and then the course changes. And companies don't cope up with, so we are not able to utilize that equipment effectively.
Right.
As if that wasn't enough, now what's happened is that with this pandemic, children can't come and there is no connectivity. So even we gave phones to people because it's, we get charity, so we run the school on charitable grounds, but there's no connectivity. So effectiveness of education, and the only medium we found was that through YouTube, but which is, then you have no control on them. So you have anything to offer, anything to suggest? We have about 600 children there.
So I completely, I understand and empathize with the point that you made, that connectivity is a very big issue. So at the end of the day, you have BharatNet, which the government has, put in place and which reaches the furthest corners of India. And to that extent, technically and technologically, you are connected. But is internet connectivity a big issue in many smaller places? And forget smaller places. Even if we go to tier 2 towns or cities of this country, you have that issue. That the latency is there, and there's a big issue in terms of thing. And there can be nothing more irritating when you're learning something online if the internet connection is not stable. So I think the answer to that is that there is no short-term fix to this. Frankly speaking, it is technology is an enabler, internet is an enabler. Online education will change the future destiny of this country. I have no doubts about that. But unfortunately, it will happen in pockets. It won't happen all across 1.35 billion Indians in one shot. So we follow a couple of villages in Maharashtra where it's not just the education but the overall livelihood, sanitation, crop protection, water harvesting, and all of that. So all of these actually we're trying to address in a more holistic fashion, and obviously to be able to improve the lot of the villages. But in terms of education, we are finding a big challenge. First and foremost, finding teachers. Then if you do the online piece, the online content, frankly speaking, sir, I've seen a lot of that, is so boring that a child cannot sit in front of that. It is more so for these children who, in rural areas and in the back of beyond areas, that we create content that is so attractive, which is so engaging that they have a desire to learn. It is just they almost feel that wasting 1.5 hours, 2 hours time in schools. They'd much rather go out there and work on the fields or do some other labor on which they can earn a little bit of salary. So the unfortunate answer to that is that no, there is no short-term fix to this. There is no immediate answer to this. I just hope that with the rollout of internet and with eventually 5G coming, more and more of investment coming from people like Jio and from the government, that this infrastructure will improve. But in the short term, it's a massive challenge. Our internet connectivity is a massive challenge.
Vicky,
Next question, Rohit.
it is very interesting lecture, explanation that you gave on e-learning. I have never heard so much about this. It's a totally new subject for me. But I feel one thing, that only after 15 years, the generation that comes, they will come to know what advantages are there, what are not. I personally feel that comradeship will be lost. The physical health may not be as good, and the children will not be coming out in sun, and the eyes, I don't know what effect it will have studying, and in the closed atmosphere. Please understand, we have comfortable houses. There are so many where 2 children, 3 children studying in 10 by 8 rooms. What is going to happen to that? I do not know. I personally feel there are pros and cons. You are given all the pros, but there are many cons which perhaps remain unanswered. Perhaps the best thing will come after 15 years as to what has happened and what the children are now next generation.
I don't disagree with you, sir. So I think there are 2-3 aspects to this. First and foremost, this whole thing about work from home. Now what is happening is that children are not going to school. The older people are not going to offices. And typically in a small house, you could have 3 generations, cooped up all the time. For each one of us, our personal space has got severely constrained as a result of that. What personality changes that will bring about, we don't know yet. What it will do to the cognitive ability of children, we don't know that yet. So right at the beginning of this, I had mentioned, if you may recall, that UN, WHO have been conducting studies, and they said that in the last 12 months alone, cognitive ability of kids have declined by 20%. So the point that you made, it's not a question of providing the pros. I had made this point about the decline in cognitive ability as well. The question I think the broader issue I was, making here was that the future of education, whether we like it or not, is going to move in a certain direction. It provides India many advantages because you don't have to now go and build millions of schools and colleges for every child in this country to be able to access education. If I had to make a choice between having not being educated and then being educated in a suboptimal way, I would every single day of the week agree to being educated in a suboptimal way, because at least that gives you the basis for leading a life of dignity and hopefully being economically self-sufficient. But not just what impact it has on students. I think also what impact it has on society, what impact it has on us psychologically, neurologically, and in terms of what it does to family ties, what it does to our social dynamics. I'm totally in sync with you that much of this will become evident over the next 5 to 10 years. Just now, the pandemic has been there for only a year. It's very early to say what the benefits or the downside of this pandemic is. Not just from an education perspective, not just from a student perspective, from a broader structure of society. I think you will see what impact this has only over a period of time. So you're absolutely right. The jury's out on this.
Thank you very much.
Are you in touch with his wife, Ravneet Gill?
I have a question.
Sapna, go on.
Yeah. So I wanted to understand, thanks for this very, very interesting discussion and very relevant topic. I just wanted to understand from you, what is the level of preparedness or the readiness of the various stakeholders involved over here? So on one side, we have parents, especially mothers who are now, along with their other responsibilities, it's a kind of homeschooling that has started again. How do mothers cope with it? The second stakeholder I would say are the educators or the teachers, the professors. They have been used to teaching in a particular way, and now we have to actually unlearn and relearn the entire mode of imparting education. So how is it going to impact them? And I would say the third stakeholder would be the government. There's been always been a paucity of funds to be allocated to this sector. And if we are to really give digital learning a fillip, huge allocations have to be done. Private schools may cope, the affluent may cope, but how do government schools adapt to this, and how soon can they ramp up?
So I will address that. So the state of preparedness of the various stakeholders for Indian education actually varies. So if you look at the whole edtech space, whether you look at an Upgrad, you look at an academy, you look at a Byju's, then you have other people out there who provide online content, whether it's Coursera or Eruditus. I would say that the edtech companies are very well prepared. I think they got lucky with the pandemic because obviously nobody had foreseen that, but they saw the general direction of travel, and I think they've read it right. And I think they are very well prepared. So I would say that from a tech perspective, I can see that change happening every couple of weeks. It's not an exaggeration to say that. And the technology to deliver education, make it more interactive, make sure that we are able to bring back some elements of the social aspect of learning, all of that will get taken care of. Second is with respect to funding. The interesting thing with respect to funding is that there are lots of private equity, etc., who are very keen to pump in billions of dollars into India, simply because not only is it the single largest student population in the world, it's also the most underserved education market in the world. The third thing, which we don't talk about, but maybe I can just leave that thought with each one of you. China is a communist country, and yet the entire digital infrastructure of China has been built by the private sector there, by the Alibabas of the world, Tencents of the world. India is a free enterprise country, and yet the entire plumbing for the digital infrastructure of this country was built by the government as part of the India stack. So today, the government of India has the ability to be able to monetize the India stack in terms of providing technological access to anybody who needs it, to be able to get data analytics for anybody who needs it. And they can monetize this at a value which is absolutely unestimable at this point in time. I mean, the mind will boggle if we start to think about what that would mean. So frankly speaking, I don't think funding is really the challenge going forward, either for the private sector or for the government. So it's not as if it's only the affluent who can do it. The government could raise a lot of money on the back of education. I mean, what they've done with BharatNet, people don't talk about often, but it has effectively enabled you, at least laid the pipeline for you to be able to reach pretty much every single Indian in this country. Now think about, you start to lease out that network to various private operators, and you could end up making a lot of money. So money I don't see as a challenge. Technology I don't see as a challenge. There's one fundamental challenge that I will see, and then I'll come back to the point that you made with respect to mothers. The fundamental challenge that I see, Sapna, is the fact that how do you convert content that was being delivered in classrooms into content that gets delivered online. When you sit in a classroom, you have 30 other kids sitting with you, you have a class teacher standing in front of you, you're forced to be attentive. There is peer pressure to be engaged, for there to be class participation. But when you are sitting at home and you always have the option to turn off your camera and then start playing a video game, how do you keep children engaged in that kind of an environment? So my sense is that the challenge going forward is not going to be funding. The challenge going forward is how do we make the crossover from offline to online? And I personally think that given that we have such a large film industry and we have so much creative talent, we have so much talent around animation in this country, that India could crack that before anybody else does. And I just hope that the government becomes the facilitator between the creative content providers and the education sector. So that will be a very interesting framework to see how that evolves. And I think whoever can crack it will eventually have value, which today is sitting over here, none of us can imagine. Then let's look at the social side of it with respect to the role that mothers play. So you're right, with homeschooling, that element has come up. So, earlier there were obviously, a lot of you had your careers, there was housework, supervision of the domestic staff, the whole thing around food, etc., maintenance, and then now you have the added thing with respect to children. The thing that is important is that the social dynamic of the world will now once again get reset as a result of this. So think about all the things that we used to talk about with respect to quality time. That life was so busy, our working hours were so long, there was so much travel, there were so many other distractions that children were not getting enough quality time with their parents. Suddenly that whole equation has been turned on its head. Forget quality time, even in terms of quantity of time, that is now phenomenal. And it then becomes a question of that, how do we channelize that? How do we regulate that? Do remember that the pandemic is less than a year old in terms of the whole lockdown and, the work from home and teach from home kind of a thing. And part of that dynamic will, find its way and settle down, I would say, over the next 6 to 12 months, where, how do we keep children engaged, how to keep them out of your way, for want of a better term, and, make sure that learning does not in any way impair their social or cognitive skills. I think that equation is, people are looking at it and will get set. And part of the answer will lie in how successfully we are able to convert the offline content into online content, because that is the thing that will, create the most amount of engagement as far as children are concerned. So while from a time perspective, the extra demands on your time as a mother are clearly, a new complexity that you are having to deal with. In some ways, it is also addressing the issue that had started to creep in our society, including in India, which was that parents and children were not being able to spend enough time together. So I would say that, try and make the most of the hand that has been dealt to us, and let's focus on the positives there. But obviously, the extra pressure that it puts on you, the extra demand that it makes on your time, is obviously something which is in the short term going to be fairly punitive. So, my sympathies are with you.
Thanks a lot.
Vicky? There's a question online, I think by Ashok Sharma. How will technical and medical education provided online by practicals?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
Yeah. So how will technical and medical education be provided on practicals?
I think it was not clear. Let me repeat it. How will technical and medical education be provided online, like practicals?
So, as I mentioned some time back, this institute in Switzerland, which does absolutely cutting edge work on a lot of these matters, is today looking at, using gamers for surgery, and very sophisticated surgery, simply because their skills with their hands and their fingers are so good. Now, these are people who typically have no background in medical science, and as you know, that to be, let's say, a neurosurgeon, it is, when we say this is not rocket science, that is the ultimate rocket science. How do you make that transition in terms of using skills that people may have, even if they don't have the background to that particular domain? So my sense is that wait for a little longer to see how, this whole thing about augmented reality and virtual reality will come together to create a new concept called, XR. So read up about XR on Google. It'll give you an idea in terms of how real that experience online will be. You can be sitting in your house and in a lab, to use a very small example, although it's not politically very correct in this day and age, there's a frog dissection happening, and you will actually feel that you are sitting in that school lab and looking at that dissection live. So it's a mix of augmented reality and virtual reality, AR, VR, which becomes XR. So please read up on it on Google. It'll give you a sense in terms of what's happening. And the experience is so real, it is so immersive, it is so experiential that it is no different from actually being there, or in terms of being able to do that. So to answer your question, a lot of the pilots who learn flying learn on simulators. They don't actually learn it flying a real aircraft. And based on working on those simulators, they get put into a cockpit and they know exactly the controls. They know exactly in what situation, which are the levers that you need to pull, or how to read different gauges in the instrumentation panel, and that gives you an idea about how to fly the plane. It's exactly like that. So right now, what is happening is that we have not had exposure to that level of technology. And so we don't realize that technology can actually transcend the barriers of distance. So my request to you is read up about XR. There's plenty of it on Google, and it'll give you a very good sense about the world that we are about to step into. So one of the things about, like they say that, necessity is the mother of invention. Based on everything, the dislocation that happened on the back of the pandemic, all this thing has become no more necessary. It is no longer a good to have, it is a must have. And I think that technology is really stepping up to the party to make sure that we are able to overcome the challenges that have come on the back of social distancing, etc.
Vicky?
Are there any more questions?
I guess not, Latika. Probably can close.
Yeah. Okay. Then I'll just go ahead with the secretarial announcements. Thank you, Mr. Ravneet Gill. Akhil will do the official thank you later. I'll just quickly do the secretarial announcement. Today is World Health Day, and the message is that we should keep the focus on fighting with COVID-19 by taking all precautions like wearing masks, regularly washing hands, sanitizing as required. At the same time, also do take steps to boost your immunity by eating right and keeping fit, to look after the only wealth that which truly matters, which is your health. Today we have the birthday announcements. On 9th is Arun Jatia's birthday. I did see him attending the